She was 20 years old when the letter reached her informing her that her father had died 3 states away, and that the whole of what he had left her in this world was a worthless parcel of canyon land in the Arizona Territory. 40 acres nobody had ever wanted, centered on a waterfall that appeared on no map anyone in her town could find. It was her father's business partner, a smooth, calculating man named Reuben Castell, who had already taken possession of her father's freight company and warehouse back in Missouri, informing her with practiced sorrow that her father's debts had consumed every asset of real value, and that she was fortunate he was even honoring her claim to that one forgotten parcel out west. With $12 to her name and a deed to land she had never seen, she traveled alone to claim the only inheritance left to her, arriving to find nothing but sagebrush, red rock, and a waterfall pouring down a canyon wall exactly as the deed described. A gift so remote and so useless that even the county clerk had laughed when she paid the $11 in back taxes required to keep it. It seemed, in every practical sense, a cruel and empty joke of an inheritance. But hidden behind that curtain of falling water was a cabin no living soul had entered in a decade, and within it, a truth that would restore both her father's honor and an entire town's future. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you have ever been handed something that looked like nothing, only to find it was everything, tell us in the comments below, because this story was written for you. Adeline Marsh had grown up in the town of Larimore, Missouri, the only child of a freight hauler named Gideon Marsh, a man who built his modest fortune not through luck or inheritance, but through 3 decades of grueling, honest labor moving goods along the wagon roads, and later, the rail spurs connecting the river towns of the Missouri frontier to the markets that depended on them. Gideon Marsh was a man of few words but deep conviction, and he raised his daughter after her mother died of fever when Adeline was only 5, with a set of principles he repeated so often across her childhood that she could recite them the way other children recited scripture. That a debt owed must always be repaid, that a promise given was a promise kept regardless of its cost, and that a person's true wealth was measured not by what they held on to, but by what they were willing to see clearly, even when clarity was inconvenient or unwelcome. He taught her to read a ledger before she was 10, to spot the sleight of hand in a dishonest bill of lading, and to trust her own careful observation over the confident assurances of men who spoke smoothly and asked to be believed rather than checked. Gideon built his freight business slowly, hauling goods for merchants across 3 counties. And in his middle years, he took on a younger partner, Reuben Castell, a charming, ambitious man who brought capital and connections to the business at a time when Gideon needed both to expand into rail freight forwarding. A partnership that Gideon always spoke of with a kind of careful, watchful gratitude rather than unguarded warmth, as though some part of him understood, even then, that Castell's charm concealed calculations Gideon himself could never quite fully see. Adeline grew up in the warehouse offices as much as in her own home, learning the freight trade at her father's elbow, learning to weigh a shipping manifest against the goods actually loaded, learning the particular satisfaction of work done honestly and accounted for correctly down to the last figure. It was, in every sense, an unconventional education for a young woman of that era, and more than one of her father's competitors remarked that Gideon Marsh was raising a bookkeeper instead of a daughter. Comments Gideon waved away with the quiet observation that he would rather his daughter know how to protect herself than know how to be admired for helplessness. When Adeline was 16, Gideon began speaking, in the careful, indirect way he had of raising difficult subjects, about a piece of land he had acquired years before in the Arizona Territory, payment he had once accepted from a prospector who owed him a substantial freight debt and had nothing else with which to settle it, a canyon parcel Gideon had never visited and rarely mentioned. Holding on to it, he told Adeline once, less for any practical value than for what he called the plain principle of an honest debt paid in full, however strange the currency. He told her, in that same conversation, that if anything ever happened to him, that parcel belonged to her alone, regardless of whatever else became of the business, a statement she had not thought much of at the time, filing it away as one of her father's many small convictions about honesty and ownership, rather than any matter of practical consequence. It was a conversation she would return to many times in the years that followed, turning it over with the particular ache of trying to recall exactly what her father had meant by words she had not known, at 16, would one day matter so profoundly. Gideon Marsh's health began to fail when Adeline was 19, a slow decline of the heart that the town doctor could neither explain nor arrest, and in the final months of his life, confined increasingly to his bed, he grew quieter and more troubled than Adeline had ever known him to be, murmuring, in moments of half-waking distress, fragments about figures that did not balance and papers he needed to review, concerns Adeline attributed at the time to the natural anxieties of a dying man no longer able to oversee his own business. Though she would later understand that her father's instincts, sharpened by 30 years of reading dishonest ledgers, had been trying to warn him of something even as his body failed him. He died in the autumn of Adeline's 20th year, and it was only in the weeks following his funeral that she began to understand the full shape of what his death would cost her. Reuben Castell moved with a swiftness that Adeline, still raw with grief, was in no position to match, presenting her within days with papers showing that Gideon's share of the business had been substantially encumbered by loans Castell claimed Gideon had taken against the company in its final year. Loans that, once settled, left almost nothing of value in the estate beyond personal effects, and the single unvisited parcel of canyon land in the Arizona Territory, a piece of property Castell dismissed, with barely concealed relief, as worthless desert scrub not worth the trouble of contesting her claim to it. Adeline asked, more than once, to see the original loan documents her father had supposedly signed, and each time Castell produced only summaries and assurances, never the underlying papers themselves, citing the confusion of settling a partner's estate and promising the full records would be available once matters were properly concluded. A promise that, like so many of Castell's promises, was never quite fulfilled. Within 2 months, Castell had assumed full and uncontested ownership of the freight company Gideon Marsh had spent 30 years building, and Adeline was left with a small trunk of her father's personal belongings, $12 in cash, and a deed to land she had never seen and had, until recently, never thought to value at all. She might have simply accepted this outcome, as so many young women in her position were quietly expected to, had it not been for the particular unease that lingered from her father's final murmured worries about figures that did not balance, an unease that grew, in the weeks after his death, into a conviction she could not entirely explain even to herself, that Castell's swift and total takeover of the business was not the simple settling of an honest debt he claimed it to be. With almost nothing left to lose, and the deed to that Arizona Canyon parcel folded carefully into her trunk, Adeline made the decision that would come to define the rest of her life. She would travel west and see, with her own eyes, the one piece of her father's legacy that Castell had been so quick to hand over without a fight, reasoning in the plain, careful logic her father had taught her, that a man so eager to give something away for free was rarely giving away something worthless. The journey to the canyon country of the Arizona Territory took the better part of 3 weeks by rail, and then by a jolting stagecoach that left her dust-covered and exhausted at a small, sun-bleached settlement called Red Rock Bend, the nearest town of any size to the parcel described in her father's deed. The county clerk there, an elderly, dry-humored man named Amos Pruitt, greeted her request to locate the parcel with open bemusement, informing her that the land in question sat deep in a narrow canyon some 6 miles outside town. Land so remote and so poor for grazing or farming that no one had shown the slightest interest in it in the 15 years since it had first been surveyed, and that she would owe $11 in accumulated back taxes if she wished to formally claim it rather than let it revert to the county. Adeline paid the $11, nearly the whole of what remained to her, and set out the following morning on a borrowed mule with a canteen, a bedroll, and her father's old surveying compass, following directions Amos Pruitt had sketched for her on a scrap of paper. Uncertain whether she was fulfilling her father's dying wish or simply chasing the last, foolish thread of a grief she was not yet ready to release. The canyon, when she finally reached it, after hours of picking her way along a narrowing trail between towering walls of red and ochre stone, revealed itself gradually, the sound of falling water reaching her ears long before she saw its source. And when she rounded a final bend, and the waterfall itself came into view, pouring in a long silver ribbon down nearly 80 feet of sheer rock face into a clear pool below, she found herself, despite every practical disappointment of the previous weeks, entirely undone by its beauty. Standing motionless on her mule for a long moment, simply taking in the sight of it, the mist rising cool against the desert heat, the sound of the water a steady ancient murmur against the canyon walls. It was, she thought, watching that cascade in the golden afternoon light, a strange and useless inheritance to leave a daughter with debts unpaid and a business stolen out from under her. And yet she could not entirely make herself believe, standing there, that her father had meant this parcel as nothing more than a gesture toward an old debt of honor. She made a rough camp near the pool that first night, and in the days that followed, rather than returning immediately to Red Rock Bend, she found herself drawn again and again to the waterfall itself, walking its length, studying the rock face with the same careful attention her father had taught her to bring to a ledger or a manifest, until on her 4th day at the canyon she noticed, from a particular angle where the afternoon sun struck the falling water at a low slant, a shadow behind the cascade that did not match the smooth curve of the rock face elsewhere along the wall. A darkness suggesting some manner of recess or opening concealed directly behind the sheet of falling water itself. It took her the better part of that afternoon to find a safe way down along a narrow, water-slicked ledge that ran behind the fall, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rising excitement as the roar of the water grew deafening around her, until at last she stepped through the curtain of spray into a dry, shadowed hollow behind the falls, and found herself standing at the entrance of a small cabin, built directly into the canyon wall, its timber walls weathered gray but sound, its door secured with a simple iron latch that gave way easily beneath her hand. Inside, protected for years from rain and sun alike by the natural shelter of the Cascade itself, Adeline found a single room furnished, simply but carefully, a narrow bed, a small table and chair, a cold stove, and, most importantly, a locked strongbox resting on a shelf built into the rock wall, along with a stack of papers and journals covered in a dust so fine and undisturbed that she understood immediately no one had entered this cabin in a very long time. She worked the strongbox open with a hairpin, and patience her father had once teasingly called her most stubborn virtue, and found inside not gold or coin, but something that would prove, in time, far more valuable. A complete set of ledgers, correspondence, and notarized documents belonging to a man named Elijah Foss, whose name meant nothing to her at first, but whose careful, precise handwriting reminded her, with an ache she had not expected, of her own father's meticulous record-keeping. The journals told the story of a man who had come to this canyon 15 years before as a prospector and surveyor, working for a mining consortium, interested in developing the region's water rights. For the Waterfall, Foss's papers explained in careful detail, sat at the head of the only reliable year-round water source for the entire valley below. A source that, if properly claimed and controlled, would determine which of the surrounding ranches and the growing settlement of Red Rock Bend itself would thrive, and which would wither for want of irrigation. Foss had been employed to survey the water rights on behalf of a syndicate of investors, and his journals recorded, with growing unease across their later pages, his discovery that the syndicate's lead investor, a man he identified as Judge Corwin Vale, a circuit judge who held considerable influence across the territory, intended not to develop the water rights honestly for the benefit of the settlers who depended on them, but to quietly acquire exclusive control of the waterfall and its canyon, then charge the ranches and the town extortionate rates for access to water they had always considered a common natural resource. A scheme Foss considered both a legal and a moral outrage against the very community he had been sent to survey. Foss's later journal entries grew increasingly alarmed, describing his attempts to bring his concerns before territorial authorities, only to discover that Judge Vale's influence extended widely enough to have his complaints quietly dismissed and his own professional standing threatened, and describing, in his final entries, a decision to abandon the syndicate's employment entirely, and instead file his own competing water claim on the canyon parcel, under an assumed arrangement with a freight hauler he had once done honest business with in Missouri, a man Foss trusted to hold the claim safely until such time as it could be properly and publicly contested. A man Foss identified, to Adeline's profound and breathless astonishment, as Gideon Marsh. Her father, it seemed, had not received this land as mere payment for an ordinary freight debt at all, but had knowingly and deliberately taken on the guardianship of a water claim meant to shield an entire valley from a corrupt judge's private monopoly. A secret he had evidently kept even from his own daughter, out of caution for her safety, or perhaps simply out of the same careful discretion with which he had always guarded matters not yet fully resolved. The final entries in Foss's journal, written in a hand-grown shakier and more hurried, recorded his fear that Judge Vale's people had begun to suspect the arrangement, and his intention to travel east to consult with Gideon Marsh directly and finalize the legal protections needed to make the water claim unassailable. A journey Adeline found no further record of, though a brief notation added later in a different hand indicated only that Elijah Foss had never been heard from again after leaving the canyon that final time. His disappearance recorded by the county at the time as an unfortunate accident, a prospector lost to the unforgiving desert, a conclusion no one had apparently thought to question. Adeline sat in that small cabin behind the waterfall for a long while after finishing the journals, understanding now why her father had kept this parcel so quietly, understanding why he had insisted, even amid the ordinary business of his freight company, that this one piece of land belonged to her alone, regardless of what else happened to his estate, and understanding, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cool mist of the falls, that the sudden aggressiveness of Reuben Castell's takeover of her father's company might not have been entirely unconnected to whatever her father had known, and perhaps had begun to act upon, in his final, failing months. She spent the following weeks piecing together, with careful and deliberate patience, exactly how deep the connections ran, traveling to the Territorial Land Office to confirm that the original water claim Elijah Foss had filed under Gideon Marsh's name remained, astonishingly, still valid and uncontested in the official record, apparently overlooked or perhaps deliberately left undisturbed by a Judge Vale, who had assumed, after Foss's disappearance and Gideon's death, that no one remained alive who understood its significance well enough to defend it. She also began to suspect, though she could not yet prove it, that Reuben Castell's sudden and total seizure of her father's freight business might have been motivated by more than ordinary greed. Wondering whether Castell had somehow learned of Gideon's secret guardianship of the water claim and moved to seize control of the business, and perhaps to search its records for any documentation of the arrangement before Adeline herself could discover what her father had truly left her. It was a suspicion that would prove, in time, entirely correct. Adeline returned to Red Rock Bend and began, carefully and without revealing the full extent of what she had found, to make herself known among the ranching families of the valley below the canyon. Families whose crops and cattle depended entirely on water flowing down from the very falls she now legally controlled. And she learned quickly that Judge Corwin Vale was not merely an occasional presence in the territory, but a man of considerable and closely guarded power, presiding over the circuit court that governed disputes across 3 counties, a man whose word carried enormous weight and whose displeasure, several ranchers admitted in careful, lowered voices, was not a thing anyone in the valley cared to risk incurring. When word reached Vale, as it inevitably did, that a young woman claiming descent from Gideon Marsh had taken up residence at the canyon and begun asking pointed questions about old water surveys, he came to Red Rock Bend himself, arriving with the unhurried authority of a man accustomed to having disputes resolved in his favor before they ever properly began. He met with Adeline at the county clerk's office, ostensibly to offer his condolences on her father's passing and his welcome to the territory. But his true purpose revealed itself quickly enough beneath the courteous surface, as he suggested, with careful and deniable phrasing, that a young woman alone would find managing so remote and difficult a property an unnecessary burden, and offered to purchase the parcel from her outright at a price he called generous, a sum that, while indeed substantial by the standards of her recent poverty, represented, she now understood, a fraction of what exclusive control over the valley's only water source might one day be worth to a man positioned to charge every rancher and settler for access to it. When Adeline declined, citing her father's wishes that the land remain in the family, Vale's manner cooled considerably, and he reminded her, in the measured tone of a man accustomed to having such reminders taken seriously, that circuit court rulings in this territory had a way of finding against those who lacked proper legal representation or influential friends, and that contested water claims, in particular, had historically resolved in favor of parties with, as he put it, the resources to see a dispute through to its proper legal conclusion. Adeline left that meeting understanding precisely what kind of fight lay ahead of her, and rather than retreating in fear, she did what her father had always taught her to do when facing a figure whose confidence outmatched hers, which was to gather every fact she could verify before she moved another step. She wrote to a territorial attorney in Prescott, with a reputation for taking on cases against entrenched local interests, a careful woman named Cordelia Hanks, enclosing copies of Elijah Foss's journals and the original filed water claim. And Hanks, recognizing immediately the significance of documented evidence connecting a sitting circuit judge to an attempted private monopoly over a public water source, agreed to represent Adeline's claim before the territorial court rather than Vale's own circuit, a jurisdictional maneuver that stripped Vale of the very home advantage he had counted on. Word of the coming legal challenge spread through the valley quickly, and the ranching families, who had spent years quietly resenting Vale's growing influence without ever having proof enough to challenge it, began, one by one, to add their own testimony regarding years of subtly rising fees and pressured land sales they had endured at the judge's indirect instigation, testimony that, combined with Foss's journals, painted a picture of calculated exploitation stretching back over a decade. The hearing, when it finally came before the territorial court in Prescott, drew a surprising number of Red Rock Bend's residents, who traveled the considerable distance to see for themselves whether a young woman with nothing but a waterfall and a set of old journals could truly hold her ground against a sitting judge. Cordelia Hanks presented the case with meticulous care, walking the court through Foss's original survey, his documented fears of Vale's scheme, his mysterious disappearance, and the unbroken chain of legal filing that had kept Gideon Marsh's water claim valid and uncontested for 15 years, despite every apparent effort to have it forgotten. Vale's own attorneys attempted to dismiss the journals as the unverifiable ramblings of a man who had simply vanished into the desert. But the territorial judge hearing the case, a man from outside Vale's own circuit and therefore untouched by his usual influence, proved unwilling to ignore the sheer weight of corroborating testimony from a dozen ranching families describing years of coordinated pressure that matched, in careful and specific detail, exactly the pattern Foss's journals had predicted Vale would pursue. The court's ruling, delivered after several weeks of deliberation, affirmed Adeline's claim to the canyon parcel and its water rights in full, declared the original water source to be, per the terms of Foss's survey and the territory's own settlement statutes, a shared resource that could not be monopolized or held hostage by any single private claimant, and referred the matter of Judge Vale's conduct to a territorial judicial review board for further investigation, an inquiry that, over the following year, would strip him of his circuit judgeship entirely once evidence emerged, gathered in part from Reuben Castell's own hastily surrendered business records, that Castell had indeed been acting in coordination with Vale, seizing control of Gideon Marsh's freight company specifically in hopes of locating and destroying any documentation connecting Marsh to Foss's original claim before Adeline could discover it. Castell, facing his own exposure once Vale's protection evaporated, was forced to relinquish substantial portions of the freight company back to Adeline as part of a negotiated settlement, rather than risk a fraud prosecution that Cordelia Hanks made clear she was fully prepared to pursue. Adeline did not seek to exploit her restored control over the valley's water for personal gain, understanding, as her father surely had, that the very point of Elijah Foss's sacrifice had been to keep that water a shared and honest resource rather than a private fortune. And she worked instead with the ranching families and the town council of Red Rock Bend to establish a fair and modest system of water access that ensured no single family, including her own, could ever again hold the valley's survival hostage to private greed. The cabin behind the waterfall she preserved exactly as she had found it, a quiet memorial to a surveyor whose honesty had cost him his life, and whose careful hiding of the truth had, after 15 patient years, finally found its way into hands willing to finish what he started. It is worth remembering, when we think of Adeline Marsh, that she arrived at that canyon a 20-year-old woman freshly robbed of her father's business, holding a deed to land everyone assured her was worthless, a waterfall in the middle of nowhere that seemed, at first glance, nothing more than a cruel consolation for everything else she had lost. She could not have known, standing before that cascade for the first time, that her father had entrusted her not with an empty gesture, but with a guardianship he had carried quietly and at real risk to himself, protecting a secret that would one day require her own patience and clear sight to finish properly. In claiming what looked like nothing, Adeline restored to an entire valley the water it had always deserved to hold in common, and gave to her father's memory the honor of being remembered not as a man whose estate collapsed into debt, but as a man who had spent his final months quietly guarding the honest inheritance of people he had never even met. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Adeline Marsh's story. If it touched you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever been handed something that looked like nothing at all. Before you go, tell us in the comments, What is a time you discovered real value hidden inside something everyone else had already dismissed? We read every story you share with us, and we are grateful for each one. Until next time, stay close.